Welcome to Pro Studio Live. I'm your host Elmo, and today's show is all about EQs. You'll be learning about what they are, how they work, and most importantly, how you can use them to improve your mixes. Remember to watch our show from our website, prostudiolive.com, where you'll have access to a chat room that you can talk to us, ask us questions, and get those questions answered in real time right here on our show. Today's episode is a part of a series of instructional videos we're doing with our guest, Ian Sutton. Ian, thanks for being here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here. How are you today?
I'm doing well, man. Trying to stay dry in the rain.
Yeah, well, we're dry in the studio, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Cool. So what are we getting into today?
Well, today we've got a few different segments. We've got going over the basics of EQ, so just so everyone's on the same page. We talk about a little bit of history, very little bit of history. Some examples, talking about frequency bands, just making sure everyone's on the same page about what EQ is. And then we go into different kinds of EQs. And then from there, how to apply those different kinds of EQs, what makes those EQs different, actually. And then how to apply those onto some of the common instruments that we'll be using. Or that you guys are using in your mixes. And then things to watch out for, so EQ do's and don'ts.
Awesome. Sounds like we got a lot of information,
Yeah.
so let's get into it.
All right. Well, I don't know, first off, so EQ, what is EQ, right? If you don't know what EQ is or equalizers are, chances are you've probably used them and not even known it. Think about like your car stereo, the bass, the mids, and the trebles on a car stereo. Elma, do you play with your car stereo?
Absolutely. I tend to keep my car stereo a little flat, but sometimes when the mix just doesn't sound right, I reach for it to bring up some frequencies, and maybe that could be, something that you do in the mix from the get-go rather than at the car stereo, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's one of those funny things. It's I'll get into a friend's car and they'll have the bass boosted way up. The treble turned way up, and they think it sounds awesome. Like, but that's not how it was mixed, man.
Mm-hmm.
So typically I like to leave it flat. Also, I want to hear how the engineer mixed it, and I guess we just kind of geek out like that.
Yeah.
So let's really brief history of EQ. EQ was equalizers first started back the phone company when they would run signal through their phone lines. There would be it just wouldn't sound quite right. So they devised these electronic components to equalize the sound or equalize the frequency of the sound. So from there, EQ has been incorporated into radio, television, recording studios. I mean, it's pretty much everywhere, or just about everywhere you find reproduced sound today. So we are going to talk about really how we use EQ in the studio. So more along the lines of recording and mixing. So we use EQ in the studio for recording. Pretty much equalizers are used to remove unwanted sounds and to sweeten things, to kind of make certain instruments sound better. Pretty much the same way in mixing. When I get a song to mix, typically it's been recorded, they've probably used some EQ, but I'll use more EQ to make some of those instruments sound sweeter. To remove some unwanted sounds that maybe they didn't catch in the recording process. And the most important part of EQ when you're mixing is to make those instruments fit together. And then we use EQ when mastering also, really to make those the songs sound like they're supposed to fit together.
A quick interjection. Sometimes when I'm working with an artist, they'll talk about mastering EQ. Is there usually, in your experiences, a difference between mastering EQ and mixing EQ, or are we all talking about the same thing? It's just kind of using it in a different way.
Yeah, it's the same general thing. It's just different tools for different purposes. So yeah, we're definitely using it different from when we EQ or when we mix to when we master.
Okay.
Mastering EQ is typically more broad strokes.
Mm-hmm.
Mixing EQ can be broad strokes in addition to very fine little surgical moves to take things out.
When it comes to mastering, you kind of, for lack of a better phrase, painted into a corner, right, with the mix. Like you don't have as much control over the smaller parts, right?
Absolutely.
Cool. So that makes sense why it would be more of a broad stroke sort of thing.
Yeah, you don't want to go in and we'll talk about the different kinds of EQ and this and that. But yeah, when you're mastering, you don't want to go in and do these really fine, precise movements. You want a little more broad strokes.
How does the frequency spectrum or the range of frequencies available play into what an equalizer does?
Well, as humans, we only hear a certain amount of frequencies. So we hear really from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz, which is hertz is just a measurement. Basically, the cycles per second. So a cycle is, if you're familiar with audio waveforms, a cycle is like a push and a pull, or a
peak
compression and a rarefaction,
Okay.
a peak and a valley, like we would see on the screen. So we use EQ within that usable range, that 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Typically, I mean, there's certain EQs that go higher and certain EQs that go lower, but typically we stay within that usable 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz range. So let's take a listen to what that is. So let's start getting everybody on the same page so then we can really get to the fun stuff. So I'm going to pull up a frequency generator here in Pro Tools. And also pull up a frequency analyzer so we can see what's going on. All right, so just a little bit quickly about this frequency analyzer. We've got 20 hertz all the way down here on the left-hand side, all the way up to 20,000 hertz, or in the audio world, we call that 20K or 20 kilohertz. So let's start this sine wave going. Let's get this all the way down. Well, you know what? It would help if I had this routed correctly. There we go.
There it is.
There we go. So here's 20 hertz all the way down. As we sweep up, you can hear that frequency getting higher. We'll come up into the mid-range frequencies. And it should start getting, sorry about that if that's a little loud. That down. It starts getting a little bit louder, as you can hear, when we get into those really higher mid-range frequencies. And then we go all the way up, and you should start maybe not being able to hear that. Let me mute this so we don't drive any dogs crazy. Yeah, as we get a little bit older too, we start to lose some of those higher frequencies. So I couldn't hear up to about 17 or 18,000 hertz. Like I start dropping off. But kids can hear.
Does attending a concert or working with heavy machinery anywhere that you would be like exposed to very loud noises, does that affect your ability to understand or hear those higher frequencies?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have earplugs that I take everywhere with me, just about. Little filters that I wear at concerts so I don't damage my ears. And that's definitely one thing I tell everybody, all new engineers that I help out. Protect your ears, because high frequencies is the first thing that goes with your hearing. And as an engineer, it's your job to, or even just a music enthusiast who you like to produce your own music, it's really your job to be able to hone in on those frequencies. That's most of what we do is frequencies and volume. So if you start losing those frequencies, you're in big trouble.
Take care of your ears.
Absolutely, yeah. Prolonged listening at very loud levels is ultra bad for you.
So how as you were doing the sweep across the frequencies, I was able to connect with what I heard in a musical way. I kind of heard notes. Are notes, like on a piano, say, are those related to the frequency response and the frequency chart that we were just that you were showing us on Pro Tools?
Absolutely. Frequencies are a direct correlation to notes, musical notes. There is actually if you do a Google search for the frequency of musical notes, you'll find there's a couple charts out there. There's a couple posters you can download. I know some of my friends have wallpaper on their computer is frequency of musical notes. But there's a really helpful one that we've found. Should we show that?
Yeah, sure. Why not? We'll be showing that throughout the course. We may as well get into that right now.
Oh, yeah. Well, very quickly. There's this one here.
This is an interactive chart, right? So as you scroll over, you can see how some different areas of the frequency spectrum are related to different instruments.
Absolutely. You'll see the piano notes here, and that corresponds to the different octaves and the different keys. And then if you go up to the top, you'll see voice or vocals. So that's kind of where a male vocal lives, right in that 100 hertz all the way up to 16K. And there's root notes and harmonics and overtones and all that stuff in there. And it gives you just kind of a nice list of all these instruments.
So I see kind of a color coordination on this graph. Does that represent the different regions of what you might find on an equalizer? Maybe like the lows, low mids, high mids, etc.
Absolutely. So the EQ spectrum is really broke up into three main parts, and then kind of sub broken up into different parts from there. We've got basically the lows, the mids, and the highs. And the lows are broken up into like sub bass, bass, and you've got your mids, which are low mids, mids, high mids, and then your highs. And those, I've got some frequencies here. The lows really go from about 20 hertz to right around 200 hertz or 250 hertz. Some people call it 200, some people call it 250. It's kind of a moving scale. Mm-hmm. Low mids really go from about 200 hertz up to maybe 700-ish, right around there. And the low mids are very important. The low mids are going to be where almost all of your kind of root notes for just about most of your instruments live, in the low mids and mids. So you got to be really careful when we start talking about equalizing them and changing the tone of those things. Mids run from about 700 hertz up to somewhere between 2 and 3K. Okay. Those are your like typical mid-range frequencies. And then from there we've got 3K to 7K. That's kind of like your high mids. And then right around 7K and above, those are the highs. There's not a lot of musical note information in those higher frequencies, but there's a lot of overtones and harmonics, and we'll talk about those terms here in just a little bit too.
So one thing I'm seeing is a correlation to fundamental frequencies. What is a fundamental frequency, and how does that play into a mixing style of any genre of music?
Well, the fundamental frequency is really the first note or first set of notes for that instrument, and that's really important because if you take away if you use equalization and you carve out and take away the fundamental frequency, a lot of times you can lose the body and the punch and the fullness of a sound. So you want to be very careful not to do that. Yeah, that's kind of on fundamental frequencies. Let me see. I think I have a couple charts here. So here is, well, let's talk about kind of within fundamental frequencies, octaves and harmonics and things like that, because these are all important things that are going to come into play when we start EQing things. We've got to take into account these things. So an octave, I don't know if we want to talk about octaves. So an octave is basically twice the frequency. Okay. So if our instrument, let's say a kick drum, the fundamental frequency of that is right around 100 hertz. An octave of that would be right around 200 hertz. Or actually, even if we talk about like a bass guitar. I don't remember the exact frequency, the exact note of a 100 hertz note. Mm-hmm. Probably look it up.
There are calculators online that you can find
definitely are.
through Google that would be able to give you that sort of information, right?
Absolutely. But then an octave of that would be 200 hertz.
Okay.
So
that's just a direct multiplication of it, right? That the energy is just kind of in the same place.
Exactly. Twice the frequency is up an octave. And typically that's going to, with most organic sounds, you're going to have some fundamentals, or not some fundamentals, but some harmonics up there, up a few octaves.
Does everything that produces a sound produce a harmonic or have an octave frequency?
No, I mean, absolute sine waves definitely do not.
Okay.
When we talk about, and the sine wave is the wave we just played. When we talk about something like a square wave or a sawtooth wave, those have a root frequency, and they also have upper harmonics.
Okay.
So you can kind of, even though that frequency is, or that saw wave is played at, let's say 100 hertz, it'll have frequencies living up in 200 hertz, 400 hertz.
Okay, that makes sense.
Through there. So you can kind of mess with the EQ of that saw wave and of those complex tones, and affect the way that actually sounds, even though maybe you're only playing a note that lives down in like 100 hertz.
Now, in regards to this slide that you have up on your screen, there's a frequency that's 100 and then a frequency that's shown as 200. Would that be the same note, say, on a piano, but one octave above? Is that the same octave as a musical octave?
Absolutely.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
It makes sense as to how instruments are created and how that would correlate into how you're mixing an instrument. If you're playing a passage that's in one area and it might not sound right, maybe you're EQing out some of the harmonic or the fundamental frequency, or maybe both, something like that.
Absolutely. These are all things that we need to think about when we start getting in and EQing and changing the frequency relationships.
So there is a math behind the art of mixing and everything. That's pretty fascinating.
Yep. Get out your calculators. Enroll in some math classes.
So let's talk about the different types of equalizers. There's a couple different types, right? There's like a graphic equalizer that would be more representative of what we saw through that analyzer, right?
Yeah, absolutely. To touch on graphics really quickly, we can take just a quick look at these octave bands one more time. This is directly correlate with graphic EQs. A lot of graphic EQs work on third band octaves.
Okay.
So we'll show you what the graphic EQ is here in just a minute, but they actually work on these third band octaves. So the frequencies that graphic EQs actually work with are based on octaves or third of a band of octaves.
Okay. Is there any reason why whoever developed them first decided on a third band octave, or?
I'm sure there is, but it probably just sounded good.
Valid enough.
I'm guessing it was just some kind of splitting up an octave, and thirds worked.
Yeah. I'm sure you can cover a broad range within that realm of a third of an octave.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's EQs out there. There's 6-band octave, things like that. So, but since we're talking about them, let's pull up a graphic EQ and just take a quick look at what is a graphic EQ. What makes it special? What makes it a graphic EQ? So I've got the API 550 here. So the API 550 is a graphic EQ. Basically, it has these certain frequency bands. So we've got 31 hertz, which is extremely low. It's almost down there at 20 hertz, like that, the lowest that we can hear. So 31 hertz is really more of a feeling frequency. You'll feel that. You won't really hear it, but feel that. It's like
those would be the frequencies that be driving the subwoofer at a concert venue, and you'd feel those frequencies in your chest rather than hear them more so.
You got it. And then the next band up here is 63 hertz, which is, a nice like 808, thump. 125 hertz, 250 hertz, 500 hertz. You can see these are all octaves each other, all the way up to 16 kilohertz. And so this one just has, if you look on the top here, you got a plus and a minus. So a graphic EQ, you can basically grab a frequency and turn it up or turn it down. And it grabs frequencies around that frequency as well. That's basically the center frequency.
Now that topic that you just mentioned has something to do with bandwidth or Q factor, but we'll be getting into that later on in the course, correct? We will be touching on that sort of thing?
You got it. We
Awesome,
definitely will.
awesome. So after a graphic equalizer, what other types of equalizers are there?
So after graphic, we've got a parametric EQ. Let me pull up. I've got another API. So this is the 550. Sorry, the last one was a 560. I think I may have called that a 550. This is the 550A. So the 550A has selectable frequencies. So we've got, the way that this one works is the frequencies are here. So 100, 200, 300, 400, and 50. We can select just those frequencies. I can't select 75 hertz because that's not on there. So the parametric has selectable frequencies, and then I can take that frequency and boost it up by 12 dB or down by 12 dB. And we have 3 bands on this one. And we should talk about what bands are. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
So a parametric has selectable frequencies, and a graphic basically has fixed frequencies, even though parametric is slightly fixed.
Now, I know that I like to use the API 550 series of EQs on a lot of my own productions, but I'm familiar with the 550A and the 550B. They have a little bit of different functionality. One has 4 bands and one has 3 bands. Does that mean they're different EQs? Are they working differently, or is it simply that there's more flexibility in what you get to do with it?
The B, I believe, yeah, it has that 4th band. So it's a little more flexible. I believe that the frequency choices that APIs put on those are slightly different as well.
Okay.
So just a little bit different flavor.
Okay. But, I mean, speaking in terms of it being either a graphic or parametric, it's pretty much the same as the 550A, which is also another parametric, correct?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Yeah, there's all sorts of different flavors of EQ out there. And I've got a bunch of them. We'll pull up a bunch of them and show you guys why you might pick an API over a Neve or something like that. So
cool.
Okay.
Something I'm also seeing on this EQ is a filter on the bottom of this plugin. What is filtering doing in accordance to equalizing or frequencies? I hear that term all the time.
Yeah, filtering on this one, filtering is just cutting out the low end. So filtering out the bottom, filtering out the bass. Filtering typically, the terminology is a little washy here and there, but what we normally use for filters is a high pass filter and a low pass filter. So we usually use filters to either cut out a lot of the low end that we don't want, or cut out a lot of the high end that we don't want. Some people will call individual bands filters, different kinds of filters. So the terminology is a little flexible there. But yeah, for this filter is a low filter.
Okay.
Low cut filter.
Now, sometimes in my productions, there's an interesting loss of information that I experience in certain frequencies. I may duplicate a track, and all of a sudden, there's a severe change in what I'm hearing. I looked it up, and I found that the term is comb filtering. Now, is that the same thing as a high-pass filter or a low-pass filter? What exactly is comb filtering?
Comb filtering is going to be this kind of, gosh, I don't have an example to show you, but it's where certain frequencies are canceled out because of, it's typically when you have 2 sound sources that are the same, that are playing from different points in time.
Okay.
So then you'll get a filtering of a certain frequency that's directly related to the distance that those are being played apart.
Okay.
And then I think it's I don't want to get it wrong here, but it's a fundamental, or it's a harmonic, or it's an octave of each one of those frequencies. So
that makes sense. So it's almost as if you have, say, like a peak of a waveform visually, and then another peak of that same waveform kind of canceling it out, so to speak, right?
Yep.
Okay, so there's like a physical aspect to this filtering of information.
Yeah, and it's an extreme cut. It cuts very hard. and then it cuts again very hard, and then again very hard. So when you look at it, it looks like a comb.
Okay.
The actual graph of the filter.
That's very fascinating. That's very fascinating.
So,
would that ever be desirable, maybe, in the right circumstances?
oh
I assume?
boy, possibly.
Maybe in like electronic music for a specific sound or something, a comb filter effect might be cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
They do sound pretty unnatural. So, you know, in an organic recording, organic mix, you know, jazz, orchestral, anything like that, comb filtering is probably going to sound like it doesn't belong. However, yeah, electronic music, you can use it as an effect, something cool to kind of give a little head change.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's art.
Yep. So. I recently mixed an EDM track, and in the track there was a synthesizer that had a rise going up into the big drop of the beat, and there was a really interesting texture of it, kind of having almost like a whistle as it progressed. That would be something of a resonance, right? Involved with the filter of it, correct?
Oh yeah.
How does that play into filtering and equalizers and whatnot? Is there some significant difference between a filter and maybe a resonant filter, other than just the resonance of it?
Yeah, let's explore fully parametric EQs, because that will give us the opportunity to recreate that effect, which is
awesome.
Really cool. So moving on to a fully parametric EQ. I'm just going to pull up the good old EQ3 from Pro Tools. Now, this is a fully parametric EQ. Fully parametric means they don't have certain bands that they stop on, or certain frequencies that they stop on. You can dial up pretty much any frequency in this EQ. So if we look at, here's the filter bands, like we talked about with the last EQ, filtering out the lows, filtering out the highs. But then we have these 5 other bands here. And these other bands, we can choose the frequency of the band. And if you look up here, you can see that frequency moving around. So we can choose just about any frequency. And then from there, we can turn that frequency up, turn it down. Oh, this is we'll go into the different curves here in just a little bit.
This is just to illustrate the functionality of a fully parametric EQ.
Exactly. And then also on a fully parametric EQ, a lot of them you'll have, let's go to this next band. We have control over, I think you mentioned it earlier, the bandwidth. So as you see, you can see how much this is actually pushing up around the center frequency. So this is the center frequency, 200 hertz. I just want to actually play a little bit of this for you so you can kind of hear the difference. Well, as we switch the bandwidth around right here. Let's pull this down. I hope this isn't too loud.
Track's muted.
Thank you. So as we push that frequency up, you hear the difference that makes.
Oh yeah.
And if we mess with the bandwidth,
gotta get my ducks in a row. Gotta get
more bandwidth
in a row.
You can hear it really grabbing a lot more frequencies around that center frequency.
That's interesting. You know, when I was first being exposed to equalizers, I had seen something like that where you would raise up the band on the equalizer rather, and I would see kind of this hill, for lack of a better phrase, when I was experiencing it for the first time. And at first I just thought that was a way for me to quickly identify where I was working, but that's actually a representation of all of the other frequencies around the center frequency that's being affected, and how you can change that, make it broader or more narrow. I did notice that as you made it more narrow, I started to hear part of that whistle that I was mentioning to you. Could that be what resonance is doing? Is it's increasing at a much smaller bandwidth a certain center frequency?
Yeah. When you hear that resonance sound, that it's really popular in dance music for that kind of filter sweep. It's typically the resonant frequency on something like that is typically on the edge of a cut.
Okay.
So let's explore the different types of curves that a fully parametric has, and then that'll actually flow right into
Perfect.
that filter sweep, because it kind of combines a couple of those.
Right.
So the different bands that a fully parametric EQ has, or it can have. So the first one is a high pass filter, or you'll also hear it referred to as a low cut. So I'm going to just engage this, and as I move the frequency up, you'll see it's cutting off the lows, or actually letting all the high frequencies pass. Mm-hmm. Let's just play this so everyone can hear the difference. So as I move the frequency up, all of the lows or the bass gets cut. So that's a high pass filter or low cut filter. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the low pass or high cut filter, which is the same thing, only exactly different. Here, so we'll hear this one. You can hear all of the definition kind of going away as we cut all the highs, as we bring them back in.
Now, do filters of this nature have bandwidth options? Maybe not necessarily on every equalizer, whether it's hardware or software, but is there a way to further shape a high pass or a low pass filter?
Absolutely. We've got, if you see the next option here, within that same filter is the filter order. So we've got how many decibels per octave. It's pretty common to have a 6 dB per octave cut or slope. And actually, if I move this over, you can not only hear but see the difference there. So there's a 6 dB per octave cut, 12 dB, 18 dB, and 24 dB. Okay. Let's just take a quick listen to how that sounds. So 24 dB, a very steep cut. Let's dial it back down. So the less decibels per octave, the less steep the cut. Typically, almost a little more musical. So
okay,
less surgical, more musical.
You mentioned decibels per octave, and that kind of goes back to what you were first mentioning at the beginning of the show, being the order of octaves, or just the fact that there are octaves in this equalization world, if you will.
Yeah, and in the EQ world, or in filters anyway, they use decibels per octave because when you think about octaves, and as you get up higher in the octaves, there's a lot more actual frequencies within the higher octaves. The lower octaves might have 100 frequencies per octave, from 100 to 200, and then when you get up to between 8,000 and 16,000, you've got 8,000 frequencies within that one octave. Yeah, so that's why they go dB per octave cuts instead of dB per 100 hertz or something like that.
I do notice that in that last passage you played, as you were affecting the decibels per octave, or what was the term that you used, the factor of decibels? Either way, it escapes me. Yeah. Regardless,
order number.
Order number. There you go. It didn't necessarily change too much, so much as it just kind of the 24 decibels per octave was almost like it was clamping down. And then as you released, as that number got smaller, you were allowing more information through. More of the low end information was coming back, and that kind of helped things to be, smooth. Musical was the word that you were using. That's a great word to use for that.
It's a much smoother way to operate this EQ. Sometimes it sounds great, and sometimes it doesn't do enough. So that's really where having the fully parametric is a really nice option to be able to totally sculpt that sound. Whereas remember on that API that we showed, you mentioned let's take these off. You mentioned the cut there. That was only, I think that's a 12 dB cut. I'm not sure actually on the API.
Some units of equalizers may have preset filtering options that you can't change, and then some you can change. I guess that's just a fully parametric EQ at that point if you're able to change the filtering options as well as all of the information of the bands in which you're changing. Now, I know that there are some companies that make like 10, 20 band equalizers. What would there be anything to kind of, is there anything wrong with having more than 4 or 5 or 6 bands of equalization options? Does that mean that there's something wrong or what have you? What would be the purpose of having that many bands?
To really just get in and be very surgical.
Okay.
When we talk about EQs in the studio and in recording and mixing, there's a lot of options to choose from, and some of those options allow you to get a sound very quickly because there's a few choices. So those are great. I love those. And some of them, but you're not able to go as surgical as you'd like to. If you have one frequency that's really driving you crazy and you can't get to that frequency, you might go with something that has more bands that's a little bit more surgical. Typically, those digital EQs with more bands will allow you to be very surgical.
Okay.
Sometimes I find sometimes too many choices is not always the best for workflow.
I agree.
So I'll try to use a little more simple EQ so I can work fast. And then when it's not doing what I want it to do, I'll grab maybe something with more bands that can be a little bit more surgical.
Now, is there a way to, hypothetically here, is there a way to EQ without necessarily needing to EQ? I don't really want to go too far into it. I'm sure that there's a world of different avenues to explore there. But, I mean, could you maybe, let's say you have a vocal and instead of, you reached for a graphic EQ and it just wasn't working. And then you reached for a parametric and it wasn't working. A fully parametric, it just wasn't working. At that point, if you had control over it, that could be something of a mic placement sort of thing, correct? Or the environment in which it was tracked. It's all a system, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you nailed it on the head there. The mic placement is probably, out of what you said, was really what grabbed me. Microphone placement is like natural EQ.
Okay.
It's natural equalization. It's reaching for an EQ when you're recording should not be the first thing you do. If it doesn't sound right, change it at the microphone. That's these toys are fun and they're cool and I love playing with them. But when you start out recording, just if it's not where you want it, change the mic placement. That's very, very, very important.
I've had some experiences as a tracking engineer where I should have changed the microphone placement. I've had experiences as a mixing engineer where I should have, I wish I had the ability to change the microphone placement. But I think equalizers are an invaluable tool at the arsenal of a mixing engineer, of a mastering engineer, of any audio professional. I think it's a great thing to have, and it helps clarity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They help, like we mentioned earlier, they help sweeten some sounds and remove the things out of those sounds you don't want. One thing, EQs, they change the frequencies by introducing a little bit of phase discrepancies, and that's really how they work. So you do want to be careful, like you said, if you can fix it at the mic, fix it at the mic. Be careful with your EQs.
That may be why I've experienced some sort of, I EQ something and it starts to feel like there's something missing, and it's not because it's not there. I didn't go in with an eraser and erase it out. It's just, you mentioned phase, and there's a couple users on the chat room talking about phase as well. We'll be getting into more in depth about phase in the show, correct?
We talk maybe slightly a little bit about it.
Okay. I mean, that's kind of how it interacts with the frequencies that it's working with. Is it introduces a shift in that region, right?
It's really that's how, without actually going too deep into it, that's how equalization works. It takes a signal, splits it, does a little phase shift, and and then you get boosts and cuts of certain frequencies.
Okay.
So I don't want to get too deep into the inner workings of it because
Yeah.
we want to talk about how to use it.
That'll be a
but
whole.
yeah,
that'll be a whole thing.
There are technical papers written about that kind of stuff. So, let's see, a couple more bands.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the next couple bands. So high pass, low pass, those are great. I use those all the time. The next type of filter is a shelf. So let me turn that one off. And if we turn this guy up, you see it looks like a shelf. So we've got everything below this frequency of 100 hertz is boosted or cut. So that's a shelving filter, a shelving band. Sorry, shelving curve. That's a little bit more technical. And you could change the Q on that too, and we'll talk about Qs. The next type of filter is a bell filter, a bell curve, next type of curve. So the bell curve, like you mentioned, a hill, looks like a hill. It also looks kind of like a bell. So the bell curve is probably one of the most used. You'll see on this EQ, the low frequency can be turned into a bell curve as well. So there's essentially 5 bell curves on here. 2 of those can be turned to shelving frequencies, so high shelf and low shelf. And then 3 just bell-only curves.
Okay. Now I'm noticing on the filtering options up above, there's a selector to change the filter to, is that a notch or? Yeah.
These guys here?
Uh-huh.
Yep. That's another type of filter, a notch filter. So if we turn this on, if we look up here, in the low pass and the high pass, we've got this little guy right here, this little button, and that's a notch filter. And if I pull the frequency down, you'll hear that is an extreme cut in that frequency. So if you really hated what was in 3.34 kilohertz, a notch filter is going to completely remove that.
And some equalizers may have the ability to have notches and some may not, or is that something that's built into most every equalizer?
Some do, some don't. That may be one reason why you choose a certain equalizer over another, because it has the ability to notch,
Okay.
or to do other types of curves.
And that also is, you can change the bandwidth of a notch, correct?
Yes, on this one you
On this one.
absolutely can.
Okay.
So a nice tight notch, or cut out half the track.
I mean,
Now-
if sometimes it calls for it. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say go change the microphone, but it happens.
Yep. And now the notch is going to be a lot more, or a lot less forgiving than a bell curve. A bell curve at the same frequency is not going to cut out quite as much as a notch.
Okay. All right. Well, I believe it's time for a break at this point. We have a lot of information to be covering on this show, so we're going to make this a short break. This break is only going to be about 15 or so minutes, so hold tight. We'll be coming back soon with more about exploring different types of EQs and the different functionalities around them.